You know exactly what you're supposed to do. That's the part nobody talks about. The self-help industry is built on the premise that you lack information, that the missing piece is the right framework, the right habit stack, the right morning routine delivered by the right voice at the right tempo. But you already know. You know you should sleep more and drink less and stop checking your phone at 2 in the morning. You know the conversation you've been avoiding needs to happen. You know the thing you keep almost starting. You know which relationship is costing you more than it's returning. You know, you just haven't done it. This is a more interesting problem than not knowing. And it is the actual problem. For almost everyone, almost all of the time. I want to tell you something I noticed about myself years before I had the vocabulary to understand it. I was the person who read the book, underlined the passage, felt the recognition, closed it, and returned to doing exactly what I had been doing before. Not because the book was wrong, because understanding something and living according to what you understand are almost entirely separate skills, and almost no one tells you that. They tell you the insight. They leave out the gap. The gap is what this book is about. Not the information. The gap. The specific, persistent, deeply human distance between knowing what a better version of your life looks like and actually building it. Why the gap exists. What maintains it. What, slowly, imperfectly, without dramatic transformation, closes it. Here is what I can tell you honestly about what's inside it. There is no moment in this book where everything clicks and the path forward becomes obvious. That moment doesn't exist in books. It exists occasionally in lives, but it arrives sideways, usually during something mundane, always after considerable unglamorous work that didn't feel like progress while it was happening. What this book can do is make that work slightly more directed, slightly less lonely, slightly more informed about why the resistance you feel is not evidence of your inadequacy, but evidence of your humanity. The psychology in here is real, not the popular version, not the findings that survived the journey from research paper to Instagram caption intact. The actual research, which is messier and more specific and considerably more useful than the version that fits on a poster. The actual research says things like, confidence follows action, it does not precede it. Resilience is not toughness, it is elasticity. Purpose is not discovered, it is constructed. Letting go is not a feeling. It is a decision you make approximately 40 times before it begins to stick. None of these are comfortable findings. They are accurate ones. And accuracy, it turns out, is more useful than comfort. Particularly for the person who already has the comfort version and is standing in the same place they were a year ago, wondering why. You are not here because you lack motivation. Motivated people read books like this one and remain stuck all the time. You are not here because you lack intelligence or capacity or the raw material for a different kind of life. You are here because the gap between knowing and doing is real and specific and closable, and you have, at some level, decided it is time to take it seriously. That decision is the only prerequisite for everything that follows. Let's begin. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I read every single one. It's always interesting to see where this reaches. Chapter 1, The Operating System Nobody Asked For. A woman walks into a job interview she is completely qualified for. She knows she's qualified. Her resume knows she's qualified. The hiring manager will later say she was the strongest candidate on paper. She doesn't get the job, not because she failed the interview, but because somewhere in the first 4 minutes, she decided she was going to. She couldn't have told you why. It felt like intuition. It was not intuition. It was a belief running silently in the background that people like her don't get things like this. That's not a confidence problem. That's a software problem. Your mind runs on beliefs the way a computer runs on code. Most of that code was written before you were 12. Some of it was written before you could form a sentence. And almost none of it was written by you. It was written by the environment you were raised in, the people who raised you, the things they said repeatedly, and, perhaps most powerfully, the things they never said at all. You inherited a cognitive operating system. It came pre-installed. You did not get to review the terms and conditions. This is not a metaphor designed to make you feel like a victim. It's a description of a mechanism, one that operates in every human being without exception, and one that can, with effort, be examined and changed. The psychological term is schema. A schema is a mental framework, a filter through which new information passes before you consciously register it. Schemas determine what you notice, what you ignore, what you interpret as threat, what you interpret as opportunity. They are extraordinarily efficient. They are also extraordinarily stubborn. A schema built on the belief that you are fundamentally unreliable will find evidence for that belief in situations that have nothing to do with reliability. It will find it because it is looking. This is the part most self-help content gets wrong. It tells you to think positively, to replace negative thoughts with positive ones, as if the issue were a bad thought floating through an otherwise neutral mind. The issue is the filter. You can pour positive thoughts into a negatively calibrated system indefinitely. The system will process them and return the same output it always has. What actually changes schemas is not repetition of positive statements. It is repeated experience that contradicts the existing belief, followed by conscious reflection on that contradiction. The experience has to come first. The insight follows. This is why simply telling yourself you are capable does not work, and why doing something small and difficult and completing it does. The brain is not persuaded by arguments. It is persuaded by evidence. I once spent 3 months journaling about a belief I wanted to change. Wrote about it carefully, analytically, every morning. Tracked my thinking, noted my progress. At the end of 3 months, the belief was exactly where I had found it, slightly more articulate about its own existence. The update mechanism of the mind is behavioral, not verbal. You do not think your way to a new belief. You act your way there, imperfectly, inconsistently, with significant backsliding, until the accumulated weight of contrary experience finally tips the scale. What this means practically is both simpler and harder than most people want it to be. Simpler, because the intervention is not complex. You identify a belief that is limiting you. You find the smallest possible action that contradicts it. You do that action. You notice you survived. You do it again. Harder, because the belief will resist. It will generate entirely plausible reasons why this particular situation is the exception. It will dress resistance up as wisdom. It is very good at this. Beliefs that have been with you for decades do not surrender after a single contradictory experience. They require a sustained campaign of evidence. The campaign is boring. It does not feel like transformation. It feels like Tuesday. The woman who didn't get the job applied again 6 months later. Different company, same role. She had not, in that interval, done affirmations in the mirror. She had taken on 3 projects she was certain she'd fail at, and failed at none of them. She got the job. She still felt walking in like someone who might not. The belief was still running. It was just running on older data. That's what changing your operating system actually looks like. Not silence, not replacement. Outdated software, still present, steadily losing relevance against the weight of everything you've done since. Chapter 2. The Confidence Fraud. There is a man at every networking event who walks in like he owns the building. Handshake firm, eye contact steady. He introduces himself with the relaxed authority of someone who has never once doubted whether he belongs in a room. 6 months later, you find out he was terrified the entire time, not performing confidence, genuinely biologically terrified, and doing the thing anyway. That is not what most people picture when they hear the word confidence. Most people picture the feeling, the internal sensation of certainty, of readiness, of knowing you can handle what's coming. They believe this feeling is what confident people have before they act. This is almost entirely backwards. The feeling is what confident people have after they've acted, repeatedly, in conditions that were uncomfortable, with outcomes that were sometimes embarrassing. Confidence is not a prerequisite for action. It is a residue of it. This distinction matters more than it might appear. Because if you believe confidence is something you need before you begin, you will wait for it. And it will not arrive. It will not arrive because it was never designed to arrive on its own. It is manufactured, not delivered, built, not discovered. And the building process is not glamorous. It is a series of kept promises made to yourself, most of them small, almost all of them unremarkable. Psychology has a name for the internal mechanism involved: self-efficacy. Albert Bandura's term for your belief in your capacity to execute a specific task in a specific domain. Not general confidence, specific confidence. This is why a person can be utterly assured in a boardroom and paralyzed at a dinner party, or fearless on a stage and unable to make a phone call they've been putting off for 3 weeks. Confidence is not a personality trait distributed evenly across a life. It is domain-specific, evidence-based, and built one completed action at a time. The self-help industry does not love this finding. It prefers the version where confidence is unlocked, where the right mindset shift or the right morning routine releases something that was always inside you, waiting. That version is more compelling. It is also not supported by the research. What the research supports is considerably less poetic. You become confident at things by doing them badly, then less badly, then adequately, then well. The arc is long. The early stages are not enjoyable. I told someone once that I was confident about public speaking. They asked when that had happened. I genuinely could not identify the moment, only that there had been a period years earlier when I was not, and a long, unglamorous interval of doing it anyway. And then at some point the dread had become something more like mild alertness. There was no transformation, just accumulation. What undermines this process, reliably and efficiently, is the voice that arrives during the early bad stages and announces that the badness is permanent. That this is not the beginning of a learning curve, but evidence of a ceiling. Most people believe this voice. They call it honesty. It is not honesty. It is a prediction dressed as an observation, and it has a spectacularly poor track record. The other thing that undermines confidence is the comparison problem. You are watching other people at their most polished and comparing them to yourself at your most unformed. This is not a fair comparison, and it is also not an accurate one. The person you are comparing yourself to also had a beginning, They have simply had more time to bury it. There is a version of self-belief that the literature consistently validates. Not the feeling of certainty, but the decision to proceed without it. To act in the presence of doubt rather than waiting for doubt to resolve. Doubt, it turns out, does not resolve on its own. It resolves through action, and even then incompletely. The most capable people you will ever meet are not people who have eliminated self-doubt. They are people who have developed a functional working relationship with it. The man at the networking event, the one who walked in like he owned the building. He told me later that he had a rule. He made one introduction before he let himself leave. Just one. Every time. For 2 years. By the time I met him, the rule had become unnecessary. The behavior had outlasted the fear that created it. That is the whole story. Not inspiring, exactly, but accurate. And accuracy, it turns out, is more useful than inspiration. You're still here. 2 chapters in, that's not nothing. Most people who clicked this video moved on before they got uncomfortable. You didn't. Which means something in here is hitting close enough to stay. If that's the case, subscribe. Not because this channel needs it, because the next time you want this kind of thinking, you'll want to find it without looking for it. That's all. Back to the part that actually matters. Chapter 3, The Reframe Racket. A man loses his job on a Thursday. By Friday morning, 3 separate people have told him it's a blessing in disguise. By Saturday, someone has sent him a quote about doors closing and windows opening. By Sunday, he is sitting alone in his kitchen, still unemployed, now also mildly furious at everyone who has tried to make him feel better about it. This is what happens when reframing is done to someone instead of by them. The concept itself is legitimate. Cognitive reframing is one of the most well-validated tools in clinical psychology. The core insight is real. The meaning you assign to an event is not the event. 2 people can experience the same setback and construct entirely different realities from it. Not because one is deluded and one is clear-eyed, but because meaning is interpretive, and interpretation is a skill that can be developed. The piece doesn't change. Your angle does, and the angle determines almost everything about what you do next. But somewhere between the therapy room and the self-help aisle, reframing got repackaged as something faster and easier than it actually is. It became synonymous with positive thinking, with the idea that if you just look at a bad thing from the right direction, it stops being bad. This is not reframing. This is avoidance with better posture. Real reframing does not deny the reality of what happened. It does not skip the part where the thing was bad. It starts exactly there, in the full acknowledgement of the loss, the failure, the disappointment, and then asks a different question. Not, how can I feel better about this? But, given that this happened, what is now true that wasn't true before? What has this changed? What does this make possible or necessary that I was previously ignoring? Those are harder questions. They take longer. They do not fit on a card. The psychological mechanism underneath reframing is something researchers call explanatory style, the habitual way you explain bad events to yourself. People with what's called a pessimistic explanatory style tend to explain negative events as permanent, pervasive, and personal. It happened because of who I am. It will always be this way. It affects everything. People with an optimistic explanatory style explain the same events as temporary, specific, and situational. It happened because of these particular circumstances. It won't necessarily repeat. It affects this area, not all areas. Neither style is purely chosen. Both are partially learned, and both can be shifted, not through forced positivity, but through the slow, deliberate practice of catching your own explanations and examining them for accuracy. Not for optimism, for accuracy. Because pessimistic explanations are not more honest than optimistic ones. They are just more familiar. I watched a colleague respond to a failed product launch by spending approximately 6 weeks explaining to anyone who would listen exactly why it had failed, in considerable detail, with real analytical precision. She understood the failure completely. She did not apply a single thing she understood to what she did next. The analysis had become its own destination. She had confused examining the wreckage with learning from it. That's a trap. Reframing is supposed to help you avoid. You are not trying to understand the past for the sake of understanding it. You are trying to extract what is useful and redirect your attention toward what is actionable. The backward glance has a purpose. The purpose is forward motion. When the backward glance becomes the entire activity, something has gone wrong. There is also a timing component that almost nobody mentions. Reframing requires a minimum of emotional processing before it becomes available. Try to reframe something in the first hours after it happens, and you will either fail because the emotion is too loud, or succeed in a way that backfires, suppressing the feeling rather than integrating it, which has its own costs later. Grief, anger, and disappointment are not obstacles to clear thinking. They are part of it. The sequence matters. Feel the thing, then examine the thing, then reframe the thing. Skipping step 1 does not make you mentally strong. It makes you a pressure cooker. The man who lost his job on Thursday eventually did find a different angle on it. Not because someone told him to, because 3 weeks later, after the initial shock had settled, he sat with it long enough to notice something true. He had been planning to leave anyway, had been planning it for 2 years and finding reasons not to. The job ending had removed the decision he'd been avoiding. That was genuinely useful information. It changed what he did next. Nobody could have handed him that insight on Saturday. He had to arrive at it himself, on his own timeline, through his own processing. That's how reframing actually works. Not a gift, not a trick, a destination you reach by taking the long way around, through the thing itself, not over it. Chapter 4. The Discipline Paradox. A woman sets her alarm for 5:30 in the morning. She has done this 11 times in the past 2 weeks. She has woken up at 5:30 twice. The other 9 times she has had a brief, surprisingly articulate conversation with herself about why today is the exception. Work was stressful, sleep is important. She'll start properly on Monday, and then gone back to sleep feeling vaguely terrible. She is not lazy. She is using the wrong model. Most people understand discipline as a matter of willpower, as a reservoir of force that the sufficiently motivated person draws from when comfort is pulling in the other direction. In this model, people who are disciplined have more of this force. People who aren't, don't. The fix, therefore, is to want it more, to care enough, to find your why. This model is wrong, and the research has been saying so for decades. Willpower exists. It is also depletable, unreliable, and a genuinely poor foundation for any system you want to function consistently. What the psychology literature actually describes is something less dramatic and considerably more effective. Discipline is not a force you summon. It is a structure you build. The goal is not to overpower your resistance. The goal is to design a life in which resistance has fewer opportunities to win. Roy Baumeister's ego depletion research, even accounting for the replication debates, points at something real. The capacity for self-regulation is not fixed across a day. It is highest in the morning and erodes with use. Every decision you make, every moment of resistance you overcome, draws from the same cognitive account. By evening, that account is running low. This is why your nutrition is perfect until 8 o'clock, and then you're standing in front of the refrigerator making choices you won't remember fondly. The disciplined person does not have a larger account. They make fewer withdrawals. They do this by automating as much behavior as possible before the resistance arrives. By deciding in advance, under conditions of high cognitive availability, what they will do, and then engineering their environment so that doing it is easier than not doing it. The alarm is set across the room. The workout clothes are already out. The unhealthy food is not in the house to begin with. The decision was made yesterday. Today is just execution. This sounds almost insultingly simple. It is. The simplicity is not a sign that it's trivial. It's a sign that the mechanism is structural rather than motivational. And structural interventions work at a level that motivational ones can't reach. There is a distinction worth making here between discipline and rigidity. Rigid systems fail catastrophically when life disrupts them, and life always disrupts them. Genuinely disciplined people build systems with tolerance for disruption built in. They have a minimum viable version of every important habit. The full workout is 45 minutes. The minimum viable version is 10. The full version happens most days. The 10-minute version happens on the days it doesn't. What never happens is 0, because 0 breaks the streak, and the streak is the actual asset. James Clear has written about this more accessibly than most researchers. The insight underneath his work is older and more clinical. Identity and behavior are in a bi-directional relationship. You behave according to who you believe you are. But who you believe you are is also shaped by how you behave. Every time you complete the minimum viable version on a hard day, you are not just maintaining a habit. You are voting in a small but accumulated way for a particular identity. Eventually, the votes add up to something that feels like character. I have missed more mornings than I have kept. For a long time, I treated each miss as evidence of a deeper problem, proof that I was the kind of person who couldn't follow through. I was measuring the wrong thing. The question was never whether I missed. It was whether I came back. The comeback rate is the actual metric. Almost nobody tracks it. The woman with the alarm eventually moved it across the room. Not because she found her why, because she made the decision harder to reverse at 5:30 in the morning, when her decision-making was at its worst. She started waking up. She didn't become a morning person. She became someone who got up in the morning, which is a different thing entirely, and the one that actually matters. Discipline is not a personality trait. It is an architecture. You do not need more motivation. You need a better floor plan. Chapter 5. The Bounce. A man gets the kind of news that reorganizes everything. Medical. The serious kind. He sits in his car in the hospital parking lot for 45 minutes. Doesn't call anyone. Doesn't cry. Just sits there, watching other people walk in and out of the building like it's a normal Tuesday, which for them it is. Then he drives home, makes dinner, and tells his wife. Not dramatically, just tells her. 3 years later, he is fine. Not unchanged. Fine. When people ask how he got through it, He says he doesn't really know. This answer frustrates them. They want a method. He doesn't have one. He just kept going. That story is both true and incomplete. Because resilience looks, from the outside, like simply continuing. And from the inside, it is something considerably more specific. The popular understanding of resilience is built around a metaphor of hardness. The resilient person is tough, solid, unbreakable. This is precisely backwards. The research on resilience, and there is a great deal of it, from Bonanno's work on bereavement to the longitudinal studies following people through genuine catastrophe, consistently points not toward hardness, but toward flexibility. The ability to bend without losing the thread back to yourself, to be temporarily deformed by pressure and return. Hardness doesn't do this. Hardness resists until it can't, and then it fractures. Elasticity is the actual mechanism. What makes a person elastic, psychologically, under real conditions, turns out to be a specific cluster of things. Not traits you're born with. Practices and structures that can be built. The first is what researchers call a coherent narrative. The ability to place what is happening inside a story that has continuity, where the current difficulty is a chapter, not the ending. This sounds abstract. It is actually one of the most concrete things you can cultivate. People who struggle most with adversity are often people who cannot locate what is happening within any larger frame. The event lands, and there is nothing to hold it. People who recover are usually people who can say, even in the worst of it, this is hard, and I have been through hard things before, and there was something on the other side of those things too. The narrative doesn't minimize, it contextualizes. The second is what psychologists call perceived control. Not actual control, but the belief that your actions have some bearing on your outcomes. Even partial, even imperfect. Viktor Frankl, writing from conditions that make most adversity look abstract, identified this as the irreducible minimum of psychological survival. The freedom to choose your response. You cannot always change what happens. You can almost always choose what you do with it. People who locate even a small domain of agency within a difficult situation recover substantially faster than people who don't. The third is connection. Not inspiration, not advice. The physical and emotional presence of people who know you and are not going anywhere. The Harvard study of adult development, the longest study of human well-being ever conducted, followed men for over 80 years and found that the single strongest predictor of late-life health and happiness was not wealth, not achievement, not genetics. It was the quality of their relationships. When this finding is presented to ambitious people, there is usually a brief silence followed by a change of subject. The finding is inconvenient. It is also one of the most replicated results in the literature. I knew someone who treated the relationship finding like a productivity problem to be optimized. Scheduled connection, quarterly calls with close friends, noted in a system. I'm not saying it was wrong exactly. I'm saying something was missing from it that I couldn't quite name at the time, and can name now. The willingness to actually need people. Not to maintain them. Need them. Resilience is not built in the absence of difficulty. It is built during it, which is the part nobody enjoys hearing, because it means you cannot prepare for adversity in calm conditions and expect the preparation to fully transfer. You become resilient by encountering things that require resilience, processing them rather than bypassing them, and noticing that you are still here afterward. The noticing is not optional. It is the mechanism. Without it, the experience passes through you without leaving the structural reinforcement it was capable of leaving. The man in the parking lot, the one with the medical news, didn't have a method, because resilience doesn't produce a method you can extract and hand to someone. It produces a person, changed somewhat. More certain of a small number of things, less interested in a large number of others. He told me once, much later, that the experience had clarified something he'd been blurry about for years. What mattered and what merely felt urgent. He couldn't have learned that any other way. Not because suffering is inherently instructive, it isn't, not automatically, but because he had paid attention while it was happening. That's the whole thing. Pay attention while it's happening. The bounce is not the recovery. The bounce is the attention. Chapter 6. The emotional weather system. A woman in a meeting says something she immediately regrets. Not dramatically. No raised voice. No visible rupture. Just a sentence that lands slightly wrong, with an edge she didn't intend. Directed at someone who didn't deserve it. She knows, the moment it leaves her mouth, exactly where it came from. An argument that morning. Unresolved, still running somewhere beneath the professional surface like a program she forgot to close. The meeting continues. She performs competence for another 40 minutes. Nobody mentions it. She thinks about it for 3 days. Emotions don't wait for convenient moments. This is their primary design flaw, and also the thing that makes them useful. The dominant cultural message about emotional control is suppression. The idea that the strong, capable, mentally healthy person is the one whose feelings don't show, don't interfere, don't complicate the clean execution of rational decisions. This model has exactly one thing going for it. It is extremely easy to evaluate from the outside. The person who doesn't cry in public, doesn't raise their voice, doesn't visibly struggle, they look controlled. They are not necessarily controlled. They are frequently pressurized. What psychology actually knows about emotional regulation is considerably more nuanced and considerably less tidy. The goal is not suppression. The goal is not expression either, despite what certain therapeutic traditions have suggested. The goal is something researchers call integration. The ability to experience an emotion fully, understand what it is communicating, and then choose a response that is proportionate to the actual situation, rather than the emotional intensity of the moment. This requires, first, a basic meteorological literacy. You have to be able to identify what is actually happening inside you before you can do anything useful with it. This sounds simple. It is not. Most people operate at the level of good, bad, stressed, and fine. A 4-word emotional vocabulary applied to an extraordinarily complex internal system. The research of Lisa Feldman Barrett suggests that emotional granularity, the ability to make fine distinctions between emotional states, is directly correlated with psychological well-being and with the ability to regulate those states effectively. People who can distinguish between anxious and embarrassed, between disappointed and grieving, between irritated and genuinely angry. These people handle difficulty more skillfully than people who just know they feel bad. Naming the emotion precisely does something neurological. It activates prefrontal processing, the part of the brain capable of perspective and choice, and reduces the intensity of the limbic response. Affect labeling, researchers call it. You are not just describing your feeling, you are partially metabolizing it through the act of description. The feeling doesn't disappear. it becomes less loud. The second component is understanding what the emotion is actually responding to. Emotions are information. Not always accurate information. Fear can be triggered by things that are not dangerous. Anger can be disproportionate to its cause. Sadness can attach to the wrong object. But always information worth reading. The woman in the meeting whose sentence landed wrong was not, at that moment, irritated with her colleague. She was carrying something else entirely, and it was looking for somewhere to go. Understanding this in real time, rather than 3 days later, requires a level of ongoing self-monitoring that most people find inconvenient until they experience the alternative. There is a concept in the literature called the emotional hijack. Goleman's term for what happens when the amygdala responds to a perceived threat and temporarily overrides the rational processing centers. In this state, you are not thinking less clearly than usual. You are not thinking in the way the word thinking normally implies. You are reacting. The reaction is fast, automatic, and calibrated to a threat assessment that may have nothing to do with what is actually in front of you. The hijack lasts, physiologically, somewhere between 6 and 20 minutes if no new threat information arrives. This is why the advice to wait before responding to an angry email is not merely polite strategy. It is neurological first aid. I responded to something once when I was clearly in the middle of one of these windows. Knew I was. Sent it anyway because I had convinced myself that the clarity I felt was insight rather than activation. It was not insight. I know this because the version of me that existed 20 minutes later would not have sent it. The version that existed 20 minutes later was embarrassed by the version that had. The third component is response selection. The actual choice about what to do with the emotion once you've identified it and understood it. This is where most emotional intelligence frameworks spend most of their time, which is somewhat backwards. Response selection is the easy part if the first 2 steps have been done. If they haven't, you're choosing responses in the dark. The woman in the meeting eventually said something to her colleague. Not a formal apology, just an acknowledgement, brief, specific, without excessive explanation. The colleague said it was fine, which it was. The 3 days of internal processing were not, strictly speaking, necessary. They were the tax she paid for catching it late rather than early. Emotional control is not a dam. It is a weather system, understood, tracked, respected, and never mistaken for something you invented. You can't stop the weather. You can stop being surprised by it every single time. Chapter 7. The Attention Economy of One. A man sits down to do the most important work of his day. He has been looking forward to this block of time all morning. He opens his laptop. He checks his email just to clear the decks. He responds to one thing, which reminds him of another thing, which requires a quick search, which surfaces an article he bookmarks for later, which takes 40 seconds to skim, which leads to a related video he watches for 3 minutes before closing. He returns to the document he was going to work on. 11 minutes have passed. He has the distinct sensation of having done something without having done anything. He works for 20 minutes, produces something mediocre, and spends the rest of the afternoon feeling vaguely behind. This is not a discipline problem. This is an attention problem. They look identical from the outside. The interventions are completely different. Attention is the medium through which everything else happens. Every skill you have, every relationship you value, every goal you are working toward, all of it is accessed through the quality and direction of your attention. This is not a metaphor. Cognitively speaking, You do not experience what you do not attend to. The meeting you sat through while mentally drafting a response to something else. You were not in that meeting. The conversation you had while composing your next sentence. You were not in that conversation. You were somewhere else, and your somewhere else was not particularly productive either. The neuroscience here is unambiguous in a way that neuroscience rarely is. The brain does not multitask. What it does is switch rapidly between tasks, with a switching cost applied each time. That cost is not trivial. Gloria Mark's research at UC Irvine found that after an interruption, it takes an average of 23 minutes to return to full cognitive engagement with the original task. 23 minutes. Most people interrupt themselves or accept interruption at intervals considerably shorter than that. The math produces a working day in which deep focus is essentially never achieved, while the sensation of busyness remains constant. Busy and productive have almost nothing to do with each other. This is one of the most underappreciated facts in modern professional life. What makes attention particularly vulnerable right now is that there are entire industries whose business model depends on capturing it and holding it as long as possible. This is not paranoia. It is the disclosed operating model of every major attention platform. The notifications, the variable reward schedules, the infinite scroll, these are not design oversights. They are carefully engineered attention capture mechanisms, tested rigorously, optimized continuously, and staffed by people who understand the neuroscience of engagement better than most users of their products. You are not failing to focus because you lack discipline. You are failing to focus because you are up against a system that has spent billions of dollars figuring out how to prevent exactly that. Knowing this does not automatically solve it, but it changes the nature of the problem. You are not fighting your own weakness. You are navigating a designed environment, and designed environments can be redesigned. The single highest leverage intervention the research supports is environmental rather than motivational. Remove the capability for distraction before you need willpower to resist it. Phone in another room, not face down on the desk. Notifications off, not silenced. Browser tabs closed, not minimized. The difference between these pairs is the difference between an obstacle and an invitation. Willpower resists invitations. Obstacles require a decision to overcome. You want obstacles, not invitations, in your deep work environment. Cal Newport's concept of deep work, cognitively demanding tasks performed in states of distraction-free concentration, is not a productivity hack. It is a description of how the brain actually produces its best output, and a recognition that this state has become increasingly rare, precisely as it has become increasingly valuable. The ability to focus deeply for extended periods is now a genuine competitive differentiator in almost every knowledge-based domain. It is also, for most people, an atrophied capacity, something they used to be able to do before the attention economy optimized its extraction. I restructured an entire working day once around protecting a single 2-hour block. Just 2 hours. No email, no phone, no tabs unrelated to the work. The output from those 2 hours consistently exceeded what I produced in the remaining 6. I found this deeply annoying because it implied that the other 6 hours were largely performance, the sensation of working without the substance of it. The man who lost 11 minutes to email and a video he didn't intend to watch. The problem was not that he got distracted. Distraction is neurologically normal. The problem was that his environment made distraction the path of least resistance and focus the path of most resistance. He had it exactly backwards. There is a version of your best work that exists on the other side of sustained, protected attention. Not more effort, not longer hours, just the same hours, with the door actually closed and the phone actually somewhere else and the work actually in front of you. Most people have not seen this version yet, not because they're incapable of it, because they've never given it the conditions it requires. Your attention is the only truly non-renewable resource you control. Everything else, time, money, energy, can be recovered or supplemented. Attention spent is gone. The only question worth asking about it is whether you are the one deciding where it goes. Most people aren't, and the systems that benefit from that arrangement are very much counting on things staying that way. Chapter 8. The Useful Weight of Failure. A graduate student submits her dissertation after 4 years of work. It is returned with revisions so extensive they constitute, in the assessor's language, a fundamental reconceptualization of the methodology. She reads the feedback once, puts it face down on her desk, and does not touch it for 6 weeks. During those 6 weeks, she tells people she is processing it. She is not processing it. She is avoiding it with the vocabulary of processing. When she finally picks it up again, she realizes within 40 minutes that most of the revisions are correct. The dissertation takes another 8 months. It is substantially better. She does not enjoy this story when people tell it about her. Failure is not the problem. The 6 weeks face down on the desk is the problem. There is a version of the failure narrative that has become so culturally dominant, it has started to function as its own kind of avoidance. Fail fast. Fail forward. Embrace failure. The rebranding of failure as secretly good has produced a generation of people who are very comfortable talking about failure in retrospect and very uncomfortable sitting inside it in real time. The discomfort is the part that does the work. The narrative comes later, and the narrative is not the lesson. What the psychology of failure actually describes is a process with distinct stages, each of which requires something different and cannot be rushed without cost. The first stage is emotional, and it is not optional. When something you invested in doesn't work, the brain registers it as loss. Loss activates grief circuitry. Grief circuitry is not a malfunction. It is the mind doing exactly what it is supposed to do when something that mattered doesn't survive contact with reality. Skipping this stage, through premature reframing, through performance of resilience, through the aggressive application of growth mindset language before the wound has actually closed, does not eliminate the emotional content. It postpones it. And postponed emotional content has a reliable habit of arriving later at inconvenient times with compounded interest. The second stage is analysis, and this is where most people either overcorrect or undercorrect. Overcorrection looks like the person who spends months dissecting a failure with surgical precision, understanding every contributing factor, producing a comprehensive post-mortem that never connects to changed behavior. The analysis becomes its own product. Understanding substitutes for application. This is intellectually satisfying and practically useless. Undercorrection looks like the person who moves on too quickly, categorizes the failure as bad luck or bad timing, and proceeds to recreate the exact conditions that produced it. Both errors share a common root: the avoidance of the specific, uncomfortable question that failure is actually asking. Not what went wrong in general. What did I do specifically that I would do differently specifically? And what is the smallest possible test of that different approach? Carol Dweck's growth mindset research is frequently cited in this context, and frequently misapplied. The finding is not that believing in growth causes growth. The finding is that people who attribute failure to insufficient effort or ineffective strategy, rather than fixed ability, are more likely to adjust their approach and improve. The operative word is adjust. The mindset is only useful if it produces a behavioral change. Used as a consolation, I have a growth mindset. Therefore, this failure is fine. It does exactly nothing. I failed at something significant enough that I restructured how I thought about my own competence. Not immediately. The immediate response was a fairly thorough internal demolition that I dressed up as honest self-assessment. It wasn't honest self-assessment. It was punishment wearing the clothes of reflection. The distinction matters because punishment doesn't produce learning. It produces avoidance. Real self-assessment is neutral in tone, specific in content, and forward-facing in orientation. Mine took about 3 months to get there. I thought I was being rigorous. I was mostly just being hard on myself in a loop. The third stage, the one that determines whether failure was useful or merely painful, is behavioral experimentation. The adjusted approach, tested in conditions small enough to be informative without being catastrophic. This stage is uncomfortable for a different reason than the first two. It requires vulnerability without the protection of distance. You are trying the new thing while still tender from the failure of the old thing. The temptation is to wait until you feel ready. Readiness, in this context, is largely fictional. You will not feel ready. You will feel cautious and uncertain and somewhat bruised. Do it anyway. The dissertation student, the one who put the feedback face down on the desk, eventually developed what she called a 48-hour rule. Any significant feedback, any significant failure, she allowed herself 48 hours of whatever the emotional response was, without judgment and without any pressure to extract meaning from it. On hour 49, she read the feedback, not to feel better about it, to understand it. The rule was not comfortable. It was functional. There is a difference. Failure is not a teacher in the way the phrase implies, as if the lesson is simply there, waiting, and all you have to do is show up and receive it. The lesson has to be excavated. It requires emotional processing first, honest analysis second, and behavioral adjustment third. Skip any stage and you have not learned from the failure. You have survived it. Surviving is not nothing, but it is not the same thing. The weight of failure is only useful if you carry it long enough to understand what it's made of, and not so long that it becomes the thing you're known for carrying. Chapter 9, The Stress That Works for You. A surgeon walks into an operating theater 40 minutes before a procedure that has a non-trivial chance of going wrong. Her heart rate is elevated. Her attention is narrowed to a specific point. She is running through contingencies she hopes she won't need. A colleague, observing her in the hallway beforehand, might describe her as stressed. She would not describe herself that way. She would describe herself as ready. The physiological state is identical. The interpretation is everything. This distinction is not semantic. It is one of the most consequential findings in the stress research of the last 20 years. The conventional understanding of stress is that it is a threat, a biological response that was useful when humans were being chased by things with teeth, and is now mostly misfiring in response to emails and performance reviews. In this model, the goal is reduction. Less stress equals better health, better performance, better life. The research, examined carefully, does not fully support this model. What it supports is considerably more interesting and considerably less comfortable for the stress reduction industry. Aaliyah Crumb's work at Stanford introduced a variable that most stress research had ignored: what people believed about stress itself. Her studies found that people who held the belief that stress is harmful, that the physiological arousal of a difficult situation is a sign that something is going wrong, showed the negative health outcomes typically associated with chronic stress. People who held the belief that stress is enhancing, that the same arousal is the body mobilizing resources for a challenge, showed different outcomes: better performance under pressure, faster recovery. In some measures, better health, same stressor, same physiological response, different belief about what that response meant, different result. This is not an argument that stress is always good or that chronic, unrelenting pressure is benign. It is not. The distinction the research draws is between acute stress, the response to a specific, meaningful challenge, and chronic stress, which is the prolonged activation of that same system without recovery. Acute stress, properly interpreted, is a performance enhancer. Chronic stress without adequate recovery is a health hazard. The problem is that most people treat all stress as the chronic variety and respond to acute stress with suppression strategies that actually impair the performance the stress was preparing them for. When you are about to do something that matters, and your heart rate rises, and your attention sharpens, and your body moves into a state of heightened readiness, that is not a malfunction. That is the system working. The appropriate response is not to calm down. It is to direct. To take the activation the body has provided and channel it toward the task, rather than toward worrying about the activation itself. The secondary stress, the anxiety about being anxious, the fear of appearing stressed, the interpretation of physiological arousal as evidence of inadequacy, is where the real damage happens. It adds a cognitive load to an already demanding situation and redirects attention from the task to the self. Alison Wood Brooks at Harvard found that people who reappraised anxiety as excitement before a high-stakes performance, same physiological state, different label, outperformed people who tried to calm themselves down. Calm is harder to reach from activation than excitement is. The energy is already there. The question is what you call it. Time management enters here in a way that's rarely discussed in productivity frameworks. Stress frequently arrives not as a single acute challenge, but as a structural condition. Too many demands, insufficient time, no clear priority hierarchy, the chronic sensation of being behind on everything simultaneously. This variety of stress is not a signal to be reinterpreted. It is information about a system that needs redesign. The body is not preparing you for a challenge here. It is telling you that the current configuration is unsustainable. Listening to this signal requires a different response than reappraisal. It requires reorganization. I ran on what I thought was productive stress for about 2 years before I understood the difference between acute and chronic. I had confused the sensation of urgency with the sensation of meaning. They feel similar in the short term. Over time, they diverge dramatically. Urgency depletes. Meaning sustains. I was running on urgency and calling it passion and wondering why I felt hollowed out. The recovery component is the piece most high performers resist most strenuously. Recovery is not laziness. It is the physiological mechanism through which the benefits of stress are consolidated and the costs are cleared. The athlete who never rests does not get stronger. They get injured. The same principle applies to cognitive and emotional stress. The rest is not separate from the performance. It is part of the mechanism that makes the performance possible. Adequate sleep is the most powerful recovery tool available and the one most frequently sacrificed in the name of productivity, which would be merely ironic if the research weren't so clear that sleep deprivation impairs exactly the cognitive functions most necessary for high-level performance. Judgment, creativity, emotional regulation, the ability to assess your own impairment. Sleep-deprived people consistently overestimate how well they are functioning. This is not a coincidence. It is the impairment doing what impairment does. The surgeon finishes the procedure. It goes well. Afterward, she is not still running at the elevated heart rate of the preoperative hallway. She has recovered. She will have another procedure tomorrow, and she will be ready for it. Not because she avoided the stress of today's, because she used it, and then she let it go. That is the whole model. Use the signal, clear the system, repeat. Stress is not the enemy. The mismanagement of stress is the enemy. And mismanagement, unlike stress itself, is entirely within your control. Chapter 10. The Permanent Student. A senior executive sits in a meeting where someone 20 years younger is explaining a shift in the industry he has spent his entire career in. He nods at intervals that suggest comprehension. He asks no questions. After the meeting, he tells a colleague that the younger person doesn't understand how things actually work. The colleague, who is also senior, agrees. Neither of them learns anything that quarter. The industry shifts without them. 2 years later, both of them describe what happened as something that was done to them. The people who stop learning don't announce it. They just start correcting other people more often. There is a particular kind of intelligence that hardens over time into something that functions more like a wall than a window. It knows what it knows with increasing certainty. It becomes less curious and more confirmatory, seeking information that reinforces existing frameworks rather than information that might require those frameworks to change. This is not stupidity. It is, in a specific and tragic way, the byproduct of success. The more your existing knowledge has rewarded you, the more your brain treats that knowledge as an asset to be protected rather than a position to be updated. The psychological mechanism is called the earned dogmatism effect. People who feel they have expertise in a domain become, over time, more resistant to new information in that domain than novices are. Not because they know more, but because they have more invested in what they already know. The expert's knowledge is identity adjacent in a way the novice's knowledge is not. Updating it feels like loss. This is why genuine lifelong learning is not primarily an information problem. Libraries and internet connections solve the information problem. Lifelong learning is an identity problem. It requires maintaining, deliberately and against the grain of experience, the psychological posture of someone who doesn't yet fully understand, even and especially in areas where you have legitimate expertise. The Japanese concept of shoshin, beginner's mind, describes this posture more precisely than most Western frameworks. It is not the absence of knowledge. It is the absence of the closed quality that expertise can produce. The beginner's mind holds knowledge lightly, remains genuinely curious about alternatives, and treats each encounter with a subject as potentially containing something not yet understood. This is cognitively uncomfortable for people with real expertise. It is also the only posture from which learning of any depth continues to occur. The research on neuroplasticity has complicated the old story about the adult brain being largely fixed after a certain age. The brain retains the capacity for structural change. new connections, new pathways, genuine reorganization throughout life, under the right conditions. Those conditions are not passive. They require novelty, challenge, and effortful engagement. The brain does not change in response to comfortable repetition of familiar material. It changes in response to encountering things it doesn't yet know how to process, and working through that not knowing. This is why learning a new skill, particularly a motor skill, a language, or a complex domain requiring sustained practice, has cognitive benefits that extend beyond the skill itself. The struggle is the mechanism, the frustration of not yet being able to do the thing and continuing to attempt it anyway is doing something structural in the brain that the acquisition of the skill alone does not do. People who pursue this kind of learning throughout their lives show measurably different cognitive aging trajectories than people who don't. Not because they're smarter, because they've kept the change-capable parts of the brain active. Reading is the most accessible version of this. Not reading for confirmation, not consuming content that already agrees with your existing views in a more eloquent register, but reading that encounters genuinely different frameworks, different disciplines, different ways of organizing the available evidence about how the world works. The historian reading cognitive science, the engineer reading philosophy, the business executive reading anthropology. The discomfort of a foreign framework is not a sign you've chosen the wrong book. It is the signal that something useful is happening. I spent a long time reading widely within a field I cared about and calling it learning. It was, in a narrow sense. It was also, in the more important sense, sophisticated staying in place. I was getting more articulate about things I already believed. The actual learning happened when I read things that made me uncomfortable, not because they were poorly argued, but because they were well argued for positions I hadn't considered. That specific discomfort, I've come to think, is the most reliable indicator that learning is occurring. Comfort, in the intellectual sense, is almost always a sign that nothing is changing. The other component of lifelong learning that rarely appears in productivity frameworks is the social dimension. Learning in isolation is slower, shallower, and more prone to the confirmation errors that solo thinking produces. The most significant shifts in understanding almost always involve encounter with another mind, someone who sees differently, who asks the question you weren't asking, who makes the connection you weren't positioned to make. This is why the tutorial is less powerful than the conversation, why the lecture is less powerful than the seminar, why reading is less powerful than reading and then having to explain what you read to someone who will push back. The senior executive in the meeting, the one who nodded without comprehending and left without asking, had a choice available to him that he did not take. He could have said simply, "I don't fully understand this. Tell me more." 4 words that would have cost him approximately 40 seconds of discomfort and returned something he currently does not have. He didn't say them because expertise had taught him that not knowing is something to be concealed rather than disclosed. This is the most expensive lesson expertise teaches, and the one with the longest consequences. The permanent student is not someone who never arrives. It is someone who understands that arrival is the beginning of the next journey, and who has made peace, genuinely, with the fact that there is always a next journey. There is always something you don't know yet. The only variable is whether you find that threatening or interesting. The people who find it interesting tend to end up, over time, considerably more capable than the people who find it threatening, and considerably better company at meetings. Chapter 11. The Purpose Problem. A man quits his job at 34 to find his purpose. He has savings, a supportive partner, and a genuine sense that something is missing from his life. He spends 4 months reading, journaling, hiking, and having long conversations with people he respects. At the end of 4 months, he has a clearer sense of what he values, a more articulate vocabulary for his dissatisfaction, and no purpose. He is also slightly more anxious than when he started, because now he has spent 4 months looking for something and not found it, which feels worse than not having looked. He takes a job similar to the one he left. 3 years later, doing that job, he accidentally finds what he was looking for. Purpose is not found. It is constructed, slowly, imperfectly, usually while doing something else entirely. The search model of purpose, the idea that somewhere inside you or out in the world, there is a specific calling waiting to be discovered, and that the task is to quiet yourself sufficiently to hear it, is one of the most persistently appealing and consistently unhelpful frameworks in popular psychology. It is appealing because it implies that the purpose already exists, that you are not required to create it from uncertain materials, that the work is primarily one of listening rather than building. It is unhelpful because it is not how purpose actually develops in human beings, and organizing your life around it tends to produce extended periods of suspension while the call that was supposed to come fails to arrive. What the research on meaning and purpose actually describes, from Viktor Frankl's clinical observations to more recent empirical work by Michael Steger and others, is something considerably more active and considerably more mundane. Purpose is not a discovery. It is a construction project. It is built from the intersection of 3 things: what you are genuinely good at, what you find intrinsically engaging, and what produces something of value for others. None of these 3 things is immediately obvious. All of them require experimentation to identify. And the experimentation requires doing things imperfectly, without certainty, before you know whether they will matter. This is the part the search model skips: the doing before knowing, the acting in the absence of clarity. Because clarity in the domain of purpose is almost always retrospective. You understand what mattered to you after you have invested in it, after you have struggled with it, after you have felt the particular quality of engagement that meaningful work produces, and learned to distinguish it from the engagement of merely interesting or merely rewarding work. This understanding cannot be achieved by reflection alone. Reflection on insufficient experience produces insufficient insight. The psychological concept most relevant here is what Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi called flow, the state of complete absorption in a challenging task that is at the edge of your current capability. Flow is not pleasure exactly. It is not comfort. It is the experience of being fully engaged without self-consciousness, where the gap between you and the work temporarily closes and time does something strange. People who experience flow regularly in their work report dramatically higher levels of meaning and life satisfaction than people who don't. The interesting finding is that flow tends to occur not in leisure, not in the activities people anticipate will be meaningful, but in work, in challenge, in the effortful engagement with something difficult. Purpose, it turns out, tends to live on the other side of difficulty. Not because suffering is redemptive, it isn't automatically, but because the things worth doing are almost always hard, and the experience of doing hard things and finding you can bear them changes your relationship to what you are capable of, which changes what you are willing to attempt, which over time shapes a life that looks, from the outside, like someone who knew what they were doing all along. They didn't. Nobody does at the beginning. The appearance of purpose-driven living, in retrospect, is the edited version. The unedited version involves considerably more uncertainty, more wrong turns, more periods of doing something for reasons that turn out to be mistaken, and gradually, through accumulated experience and honest reflection, arriving at something that feels like direction. I thought I understood what I was supposed to be doing with my life at 26. I was wrong in ways I couldn't have identified at the time, because I hadn't yet done enough to know what I was actually good at, versus what I was merely confident about. Those are different things. Confidence without competence is just noise with good posture. The competence came later, through work I wasn't sure mattered, toward goals I wasn't sure were right, in a direction I revised multiple times. What I ended up with bears almost no resemblance to what I thought I was heading toward. It is considerably better. The other thing the search model gets wrong is the relationship between purpose and other people. Purpose that is entirely self-referential, organized entirely around your own fulfillment, your own growth, your own sense of meaning, tends to be fragile. It collapses under pressure because it has no external load-bearing structure. Purpose that connects to something beyond yourself, to the people it serves, the problems it addresses, the contribution it makes, is structurally more robust. Not because selflessness is morally superior, but because connection to others provides a source of meaning that remains available even when your internal sense of motivation has temporarily gone offline, and it will go offline, regularly, in everyone. The man who spent 4 months looking and 3 years accidentally finding. What he found was not what he had been looking for. It was adjacent to it, connected to it in ways he hadn't anticipated, shaped by experiences he hadn't planned. He told me once that the 4 months of searching were not wasted. They had clarified what he didn't want, which turned out to be useful information. But the purpose itself had arrived sideways, through a door he hadn't known was there, while he was busy doing something he wasn't sure mattered. That is not a romantic story about following your passion. It is an accurate story about how purpose actually works. It arrives sideways, while you're busy, through doors you didn't know were there. The only way to find those doors is to keep moving through rooms. Chapter 12. The Letting Go Industry. A woman has been meaning to let go of something for 2 years. She knows she needs to let go of it because 3 therapists, 2 close friends, 1 podcast she listened to twice, and a book she underlined extensively have all told her so. She has journaled about letting go. She has meditated on letting go. She has written the thing she needs to release on a piece of paper and burned it in her backyard at the suggestion of someone she met at a retreat. The thing is still there, slightly singed, metaphorically speaking, but entirely present. She is beginning to suspect that the problem is not insufficient willingness to let go. She is right. Letting go is not a feeling. It is a decision you make roughly 40 times before it starts to stick. The letting go industry, and it is an industry, with its own vocabulary, its own rituals, its own economy of workshops and guided meditations and ceremonial paper burning, operates on a model that is psychologically understandable and practically misleading. The model is essentially hydraulic. Emotional pain is a substance that accumulates, and the right technique will release it. And once released, it is gone. This model produces a particular kind of frustration in people who do the technique correctly and find the substance still present afterward. They conclude that they did it wrong, or that they are somehow more damaged than the technique was designed for, or that they need a more powerful technique. What they actually need is a more accurate model. What psychology knows about the processing of difficult emotional experiences, grief, resentment, regret, attachment to outcomes that didn't occur, is that it does not follow a hydraulic model. It follows something closer to a metabolic one. The emotional content is not released. It is processed, slowly, incompletely, through repeated engagement rather than single cathartic events. The engagement is not always comfortable or dramatic. It is often quiet and repetitive and somewhat boring. You think about the thing. You feel the feeling. You notice you are still here. You think about something else. You come back. Gradually, over time, the emotional charge associated with the thing decreases. Not because it was expelled, but because it was integrated. Made part of the story rather than an interruption of it. The neuroscience of memory consolidation supports this. Memories, particularly emotionally significant ones, are not static recordings. They are reconstructive. Each time you recall a memory, you are not playing back a file. You are rebuilding it in the present with the emotional and cognitive resources currently available to you. This process of reconsolidation is the mechanism through which therapeutic change actually occurs. The memory does not disappear. Its emotional valence shifts, gradually, as it is repeatedly reconstructed by a person who is no longer in the same position they were when the original event occurred. This means that the passage of time is not sufficient on its own. You have to engage with the material during the passage of time for the reconsolidation to occur. It also means that single cathartic events, the paper burning, the confrontational conversation, the dramatic gesture of closure, are not without value, but their value is as a marker of intention rather than a mechanism of change. The decision to let go is meaningful. It is not the same as the letting go. The distinction between acceptance and resignation matters enormously here and is frequently collapsed. Acceptance, in the clinical sense, and particularly in the framework of acceptance and commitment therapy, does not mean agreeing that what happened was acceptable. It does not mean feeling neutral about it. It means ceasing to organize your present life around the project of making the past different than it was. The past is not adjustable. The energy spent attempting to adjust it, through rumination, through counterfactual thinking, through the prolonged prosecution of grievances against people or circumstances that are no longer present, is energy that is definitionally unavailable for anything else. Resentment is the clearest example of this mechanism. Resentment is almost always described by the person experiencing it as being about the person who caused the harm. It is almost never actually about that person. It is about the ongoing cost to the person carrying it, the cognitive space it occupies, the emotional energy it requires, the way it colors unrelated experiences with its particular quality of grievance. The person the resentment is directed at is frequently unaware of it, unaffected by it, or no longer present to receive it. The carrying is entirely local. The cost is entirely one-sided. I held something for longer than was useful once. Not dramatically. I wasn't consumed by it, wasn't defined by it publicly. But it was there, quietly expensive, taking up space that could have been occupied by something with a better return. What shifted was not a technique. It was a moment of genuine accounting, sitting with the actual cost of continuing to carry it, calculated honestly against the actual benefit, which turned out to be approximately nothing. The carrying had become habitual. Habits can be interrupted when you see them clearly enough. The other thing that makes letting go genuinely difficult, beyond the metabolic model and the reconsolidation timelines, is that held grievances and regrets often serve a function that the holder has not fully acknowledged. They provide explanation. They provide identity. They provide a stable account of why things are the way they are and who is responsible. Letting go of the grievance sometimes means letting go of the explanation and living for a period without a clean account of how you got here. That is uncomfortable in a way that is underappreciated in most letting go frameworks. The woman who burned the paper in her backyard was not doing something useless. She was marking a decision. The decision needed to be made approximately 39 more times, in quieter and less ceremonial ways, before it began to change anything measurable. She made those decisions, not all at once, not with full conviction each time, sometimes with considerable ambivalence. The thing is still faintly present. Most things are, if they mattered, but it no longer runs anything. It has been metabolized into the background, where it belongs. That is what letting go actually looks like. Not release, reclassification, moving something from the foreground to the background through repeated, unglamorous, largely private acts of redirection. The ceremony is optional. The repetition is not. Chapter 13. People who actually hold you together. A man is given a diagnosis that changes the architecture of his future. He is sitting in a consulting room with a doctor he has met twice. The doctor is competent, measured, and kind in the professional sense of the word, meaning she delivers the information clearly and asks if he has questions. He has no questions. He has the sensation of the room being slightly further away than it was a moment ago. He drives home. His wife is in the kitchen. She doesn't say anything particularly useful. She doesn't need to. She puts her hand on his arm, and they stand there for a moment in the ordinary kitchen, in the ordinary house, and something, not the diagnosis, not the fear, but the specific quality of aloneness that bad news produces, recedes slightly. That is not a small thing. That is, according to 80 years of research, most of the thing. The Harvard study of adult development is the longest longitudinal study of human well-being ever conducted. It began in 1938 and has followed its participants, and eventually their children, through the full arc of adult life. The question it set out to answer was straightforward. What makes a good life? The answer, after 8 decades of data collection, is uncomfortable in its simplicity. Not wealth, not achievement, not intelligence, status, or the optimization of any individual variable the study measured. The quality of relationships. The single strongest predictor of physical health, mental health, and subjective well-being in late life was how warm and connected a person's close relationships were in midlife. When this finding is presented to ambitious people who have organized their lives around achievement, around the accumulation of capability and credentials and accomplishment, the response is almost always the same: a brief, thoughtful silence. And then, gradually, a return to talking about work. The finding is absorbed and then gently set aside because it implies a reordering of priorities that is genuinely inconvenient. The inconvenience is worth examining. Most people do not deprioritize relationships because they don't value them. They deprioritize them because relationships are slow, inefficient, and unresponsive to the optimization strategies that work in other domains. You cannot will a deep friendship into existence. You cannot hustle your way to genuine intimacy. The variables that matter, trust, history, the accumulated knowledge of another person built through sustained attention over time, do not compress. They require exactly as long as they require. In a culture organized around speed and productivity, this makes relationships feel like a category that can always wait until later. Later, it turns out, is when the Harvard data was collected. And the people who had waited reported, with a consistency that the researchers found striking, a particular quality of regret. Not about the things they hadn't achieved, about the connections they hadn't made, maintained, or repaired. The research on social support and health outcomes is equally unambiguous and equally underappreciated. Social isolation is associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease, cognitive decline, and premature mortality at rates that rival smoking. Not metaphorically, epidemiologically. The body responds to chronic loneliness as a threat condition, activating stress responses, disrupting sleep, altering immune function. Connection is not a psychological nicety, it is a biological requirement. The body knows this even when the mind has talked itself into believing that independence is the more sophisticated position. What makes relationships genuinely supportive, as distinct from merely present, is something more specific than proximity or frequency of contact. John Gottman's decades of relationship research identified what he called the perceived availability of the other. The sense that if something difficult happened, this person would be there. Not that they would fix it, not that they would have the right words, that they would be there. This perception alone, independent of whether it is ever actually tested, produces measurable reductions in stress response. The brain, knowing that someone is available, relaxes its threat monitoring in ways that have downstream effects on health, cognition, and emotional regulation. This is why the quality of a few relationships matters more than the quantity of many. A large network of people who would not actually show up is not a support system. It is a contact list. The distinction is not always visible until something happens that requires the support system to function, at which point it becomes immediately and sometimes painfully clear. I underinvested in this for years in ways I justified very fluently at the time. Busy, focused. The relationships would be maintained later, when things were less demanding. What I didn't understand was that the relationships were the thing that would make the demanding periods survivable. I had the causality backwards. I thought connection was a reward for getting through the hard parts. It is, in fact, a precondition for getting through them. Vulnerability is the component that most people in competent, capable, self-sufficient cultural contexts find most difficult. Not the idea of vulnerability. The literature on vulnerability has been thoroughly popularized, and most people can discuss it intelligently. The actual practice of it. The specific act of saying to another person, "I am not managing as well as I appear to be. I need something from you." This requires tolerating the exposure of a need, which requires trusting that the exposure will not be used against you, which requires a relationship in which that trust has been established, which requires sustained investment over time. The sequence cannot be shortcut. You cannot be vulnerable with someone you don't yet trust. Trust is built through repeated small experiences of reliability. Moments where someone did what they said they would do, where they held what you told them, where they showed up when it would have been easier not to. These moments accumulate slowly. They are not dramatic. They are the texture of sustained connection, unremarkable individually and irreplaceable collectively. The man in the kitchen, standing with his wife, hand on his arm. They had been building that moment for years. Every unremarkable evening, every boring conversation, every time one of them showed up for something small when they didn't feel like it. The moment in the kitchen was not created by the diagnosis. It was revealed by it. The infrastructure was already there. That is what relationships actually are. not the dramatic moments. The infrastructure that makes the dramatic moments survivable. Build it before you need it. You will need it. Chapter 14. The Comparison Trap. A woman opens her phone at 6:53 in the morning, before she has spoken a word to another human being, before she has eaten or fully woken or done a single thing that belongs to her own life. In the next 4 minutes, she sees a former colleague's promotion announcement, a friend's kitchen renovation that cost more than her car, someone she went to college with accepting an award in a field she had briefly considered entering, and a stranger's body that looks nothing like hers. She puts the phone down. She has not yet gotten out of bed. She already feels, in a way she couldn't precisely articulate, that she is behind. This is not a social media problem. Social media is just the delivery mechanism. The problem is older than the internet by several thousand years. Comparison is one of the most fundamental cognitive operations the human brain performs. It is how we navigate social hierarchies, calibrate our own standing, assess threat and opportunity, decide whether our efforts are adequate. Leon Festinger called it social comparison theory in 1954. The observation that humans have a drive to evaluate their own opinions and abilities, and that in the absence of objective standards, we do this by comparing ourselves to others. This is not a flaw. It is a feature. It helped our ancestors survive in social groups where relative standing had direct consequences for survival and reproduction. The problem is not that we compare. The problem is what we compare, to whom, and with what information. The comparisons available to us now are historically unprecedented in their scope, their frequency, and their systematic bias toward the unrepresentative. For most of human history, your comparison pool was limited to people you could physically see: your village, your community, your immediate social circle. That pool was imperfect, but it was at least real. You saw the whole person. You saw their struggles alongside their successes. You saw them on bad days. The information was, in its limited way, roughly accurate. What we compare ourselves to now is a carefully curated, algorithmically amplified collection of other people's highlight reels. Their best moments, their most flattering angles, their achievements without context, their lives without the texture of ordinary failure and private difficulty that constitutes most of anyone's actual existence. We are comparing our unedited interior to their edited exterior. This comparison cannot produce accurate information. It can only produce distortion. The particular cruelty of upward social comparison, comparing yourself to people who appear to be doing better, is that it is self-reinforcing. Seeing someone who appears more successful does not typically motivate sustained improvement. It typically produces a brief spike of motivation, followed by a more sustained feeling of inadequacy, which reduces the confidence available for the very actions that might close the gap being observed. The comparison that was supposed to inspire ends up inhibiting. The research on this is consistent enough to be called a finding rather than a hypothesis. There is a specific variant of comparison that deserves its own examination: the comparison to your former self's timeline. The age by which you were supposed to have achieved certain things. The schedule that was implicit in the life you imagined at 22. The career position by 30. The relationship by a certain point. The financial stability. The sense of having arrived somewhere identifiable. When the actual life diverges from the imagined timeline, the divergence is experienced not merely as disappointment, but as failure, as evidence of falling behind a race that was never real, against competitors who exist only in your own construction. I spent a significant portion of my 30s in quiet, unproductive conversation with the version of myself I had expected to be by then. This version had accomplished more, worried less, and had somehow resolved questions I was still asking. He was not a useful reference point. He was a fiction I had constructed from ambition and assumption at an age when I had very little accurate information about how lives actually develop. Comparing myself to him was the cognitive equivalent of navigating by a map of a country that doesn't exist. The alternative to comparison is not the pretense that other people's lives are irrelevant to your own sense of self. That pretense is neither achievable nor entirely desirable. Others genuinely do provide useful reference points when the comparison is chosen deliberately rather than absorbed reflexively. The alternative is what researchers call self-referenced comparison. Measuring yourself against your own previous performance rather than against others. Not where am I relative to them, but where am I relative to where I was. This comparison is slower and less dramatic. It is also accurate in a way that social comparison almost never is, because you have complete information about one of the two data points. The other intervention that consistently appears in the research is what might be called comparison auditing. The deliberate examination of who you are comparing yourself to and why. Not to eliminate the comparison, but to make it conscious. Unconscious comparison operates on whatever data is most available, which in the current environment means curated, biased, unrepresentative data. Conscious comparison can be directed toward people whose situation is actually similar to yours, whose trajectory is actually relevant, whose experience might actually inform your own. The woman who opened her phone at 6:53, she put it down eventually and got up and made coffee and started her day. The day was ordinary and productive and largely fine. The 4 minutes of comparison had no bearing on its quality, except the slight background hum of inadequacy that colored the first hour and then faded, as it always did, into the texture of actual life. Actual life, it turns out, is considerably less curated than the version available on the phone. It is also considerably more livable. Not because it is better in every measurable dimension, because it is real in a way that the curated version is not. With full information, full texture, full access to the moments that don't make it into any highlight reel. Those moments are where you actually live. They are also, not coincidentally, where everything worth building actually gets built. The highlight reel is someone else's story, edited for an audience. You are not the audience for your own life. You are the author. Write accordingly. Chapter 15, The Identity Architecture. A man decides to become a runner. He buys the shoes. He downloads the app. He completes 3 runs in the first week, which is more running than he has done in the previous 4 years. On the 4th day, it rains. He doesn't go. On the 5th day, he is tired. He doesn't go. By the 2nd week, the shoes are by the door in a configuration that has shifted from ready to accusatory. By the 3rd week, he has stopped thinking of himself as someone who runs and started thinking of himself as someone who tried running for a while. The shoes eventually migrate to the back of the closet. He tells people he's not really a runner. This is the most consequential thing that happened in the entire sequence. More consequential than the rain. More consequential than the tiredness. The moment he said it out loud and believed it, identity is not the conclusion of behavior change. It is the engine of it. This is the insight that most habit and self-improvement frameworks arrive at eventually, and that most people absorb intellectually without understanding its operational implications. The implications are specific and they run deeper than most people are comfortable going. Because identity change is not the same as behavior change. It is not downstream of behavior change. It is, paradoxically, both the cause and the effect. And the direction of causality is something you can deliberately manipulate if you understand the mechanism. William James, writing in the 19th century with a precision that has held up surprisingly well against subsequent research, observed that the self is not a fixed entity, but a process, a continuous construction built from the accumulated weight of choices, actions, habits, and the stories we tell about them. The self you experience as stable and continuous is not a thing that exists independently of your behavior. It is a narrative your brain constructs, updated constantly from the evidence of what you do. Which means that what you do is not just an expression of who you are. It is the primary input into who you become. James Clear's articulation of identity-based habits captures the surface of this. Every action is a vote for the type of person you want to become. The metaphor is useful. What it undersells is how quickly the voting works in both directions. Every action that contradicts your stated identity is also a vote. For the alternative identity, the one that says you are the kind of person who doesn't follow through, who starts things and stops them, who means to but doesn't. Both identities are being constructed simultaneously. The question is, which one is accumulating more votes? The psychological research on self-concept is precise about something that the popular version of this idea tends to blur. Identity is domain-specific and evidence-dependent. You do not have a single unified self that is either strong or weak, disciplined or undisciplined, capable or limited. You have a collection of domain-specific self-concepts, beliefs about your competence, character, and consistency in particular areas, each of which is maintained by its own evidence base. The person who is rigorous and reliable in professional contexts and chaotic in personal ones is not contradicting themselves. They have built different identity structures in different domains, through different patterns of behavior, and those structures operate with considerable independence. This means that identity change is always local before it is global. You do not become a different person in some comprehensive sense. You become a different person in a specific domain, through specific behavior, sustained long enough to accumulate the evidence that updates the self-concept in that domain. The update is not instantaneous. It does not occur after one action or 10. It occurs after enough consistent behavior that the new pattern becomes the more plausible explanation for who you are than the old one. There is a concept in cognitive psychology called the self-verification motive. The finding that people are strongly driven to seek out information that confirms their existing self-concept, even when that self-concept is negative. People who believe they are unreliable will unconsciously arrange situations that confirm their unreliability. Not because they want to fail, because the failure is familiar, and familiarity is experienced by the brain as a form of safety. The known self, even the unflattering known self, is less threatening than the unknown self. Change requires tolerating the period of identity ambiguity, the interval during which the old self-concept no longer fully applies and the new one has not yet been sufficiently established. This interval is uncomfortable in a way that is rarely acknowledged. It feels like not knowing who you are, which is precisely what it is. I changed something significant about how I worked about 4 years ago. The behavioral change was relatively straightforward to implement. What took considerably longer was the identity update, the point at which the new behavior stopped feeling like something I was doing and started feeling like something I was. The gap between those two experiences was longer than I expected, and more disorienting than I had been prepared for. I kept waiting for the new identity to arrive like a confirmation email. It didn't arrive that way. It arrived gradually, almost imperceptibly, through the accumulation of enough consistent behavior that the old story about myself started to seem less accurate than the new one. The language you use about yourself during this interval matters more than most people realize. Not because affirmations change your self-concept directly. They don't, not reliably. But because language shapes the story you are constructing. And the story you are constructing determines which evidence you notice and which you discount. The man who says, "I'm not really a runner," is not making an observation. He is making a filing decision, placing the 3 runs he completed in the folder labeled Aberration rather than the folder labeled Beginning. The same 3 runs, different folder, entirely different trajectory. The alternative is not to claim an identity you haven't yet earned. That produces its own problems. The performance of an identity without the behavioral foundation creates a fragility that collapses under the first significant test. The alternative is something more precise, to describe yourself in process terms rather than fixed terms. Not "I am a runner," which can be falsified by a single missed session. Not "I'm not a runner," which files the evidence incorrectly. But "I am building a running practice. I am someone who runs." Present tense, behavioral, without the weight of a permanent identity claim that 3 weeks of behavior cannot yet support. The shoes by the door are not accusatory. They are waiting. The identity they represent is not lost. It was never fully established in the first place. That is different from failure. That is an incomplete construction, which can be resumed with the right understanding of the mechanism. At any point, you choose to pick up the tools again. Identity is architecture. You are always building something. The only question worth asking is whether you are building it deliberately or by default. Most people build by default and wonder why the structure doesn't resemble what they had in mind. The blueprint was always available. It just required the uncomfortable work of drafting it yourself. Chapter 16. The Growth Ceiling. A pianist practices the same piece for 6 months. She is good. Genuinely good. The kind of good that earns compliments at every performance, that satisfies audiences, that produces a comfortable professional reputation. She is also, if she is being honest with herself, playing the same piece she was playing 6 months ago. Not the same notes, the same ceiling. She has practiced her way into a plateau so smooth and so comfortable that it no longer feels like a plateau. It feels like a rival. This is the most dangerous moment in any developmental trajectory. Not failure, not struggle, but the convincing sensation of having gotten there. Comfortable competence is the place where most growth stops. Not dramatically, just quietly, permanently, disguised as success. The psychology of skill development has a well-documented structure that most people encounter without understanding. The early stages of learning any complex skill are characterized by rapid, visible improvement. The beginner's curve, steep and encouraging, producing the kind of progress that is easy to measure and motivating to observe. Then the curve flattens. The rapid gains slow. Improvement continues, but at a rate that requires more effort per increment and produces less visible result. Most people, at this point, either stop pushing or, and this is the more insidious version, continue practicing in ways that feel effortful, but are actually just repetition of what they already know how to do. They maintain competence. They do not develop it. Anders Ericsson spent decades studying the development of expertise across domains: music, chess, medicine, athletics. And the finding that emerged most consistently from that research is one of the most counterintuitive in the psychology of performance. It is not the amount of practice that distinguishes exceptional performers from merely competent ones. It is the type. Specifically, what Ericsson called deliberate practice. A form of practice that is explicitly designed to address current limitations, that operates at the edge of existing capability, rather than within the comfort zone of established skill, and that involves immediate, specific feedback on performance. Most practice is not deliberate practice. Most practice is repetition of what you already know, executed in conditions comfortable enough to be pleasant and familiar enough to feel productive. It produces the sensation of working without the substance of improvement. The pianist playing her best piece again is not getting better at piano. She is getting better at playing that piece, which is a different and considerably narrower thing. The mechanism that makes deliberate practice uncomfortable is not arbitrary. It is structural. You improve at the edge of your capability precisely because that is where your current neural architecture is insufficient, where the existing patterns don't quite work, where the brain is forced to build new connections rather than activate existing ones. The discomfort is the signal that something structural is happening. The comfort of practicing within your existing capability is the signal that nothing structural is happening. Most people interpret these signals exactly backwards. They seek the comfortable practice because it feels like competence, and avoid the uncomfortable edge because it feels like failure. This has a direct and underappreciated consequence for how people approach self-improvement more broadly. The reading that confirms what you already believe. The conversations with people who already share your framework. The challenges you take on that are difficult enough to feel meaningful but not so difficult that they genuinely test your current limits. All of these are the cognitive equivalent of the pianist playing her best piece. They maintain your existing capability. They do not extend it. The research on what psychologists call the zone of proximal development. Vygotsky's term, originally applied to children's learning but subsequently generalized, describes the narrow band of challenge that produces genuine development. Too easy, and the brain coasts. Too hard, and the system is overwhelmed and learning is impaired. The zone is just beyond current capability, challenging enough to require genuine effort and new processing, manageable enough that the effort can be sustained. Finding and staying in this zone requires honest assessment of where your current capability actually is. Not where you'd like it to be, not where it was at its best, but where it reliably performs under realistic conditions. Honest self-assessment of current capability is harder than it sounds. The ego has a vested interest in overestimating competence, because competence is identity adjacent, and underestimating it feels like loss. This is why external feedback, from coaches, from mentors, from people with sufficient expertise to see the gap between your current performance and the next level, is not a supplement to deliberate practice. It is a precondition for it. You cannot practice at the edge of your capability if you cannot accurately locate that edge. And locating it accurately, without the distortion of self-protective overestimation, almost always requires another set of eyes. I plateaued at something I cared about for almost 2 years, without recognizing it as a plateau. I was producing work I was proud of, receiving feedback that was largely positive, improving in ways that were real but incremental. What I didn't understand was that I had unconsciously reorganized my practice around the things I was already good at, gravitating toward the tasks where I could perform competently and away from the ones that exposed my current limits. The plateau wasn't laziness. It was sophistication deployed in the service of comfort. I had become very skilled at practicing in ways that felt demanding without actually being demanding in the ways that mattered. What broke it was a piece of feedback so specific and so accurate that I couldn't file it under the usual categories. It named the exact limitation I had been avoiding. The discomfort of receiving it was significant. The discomfort of working on it afterward was different in quality from the discomfort of working hard. It was the specific, productive discomfort of being at the actual edge rather than the comfortable interior of my existing capability. Things started moving again. Slowly, but moving. The growth ceiling is not a fixed structure. It is a choice, usually an unconscious one, made through the gradual drift toward comfort that competence enables. Making it conscious does not automatically dissolve it, but consciousness is the precondition for the decision to push through it. The pianist eventually took on a piece she was not ready for. She played it badly for 4 months. At the end of those 4 months, she was a meaningfully better pianist than she had been at the beginning. Not because the piece was harder, but because working at the actual edge of her capability had done something to her technique that 6 months of comfortable competence had not. She still plays her best piece occasionally. It sounds different now, better, not because she practiced it, because she practiced everything around it, at the edges, in the uncomfortable places where growth actually lives. That is the whole mechanism. Find the edge, work there, tolerate the discomfort of not yet being good enough at the thing you're attempting. Let the discomfort do its structural work. Then find the next edge. There is always a next edge. The people who keep finding it are the ones who keep growing. The people who stop looking are the ones who arrive at their ceiling and, after a while, stop being able to see it. Both outcomes are available to everyone. The difference is almost entirely a matter of what you are willing to be bad at, and for how long. Conclusion: rewrite. You already knew most of this, not as a criticism, as the most honest observation available at the end of a book about the examined mind, which is, at its core, a book about the gap between knowing and doing, and which would be somewhat embarrassing if it ended by pretending that gap had now been closed. It hasn't been closed. Reading closes nothing by itself. What reading can do, what this particular reading has hopefully done, is make the gap more visible, more specific, more honest about what it is actually made of. Because the gap is not made of ignorance. It is made of friction and habit, and the self-protective mechanisms of a mind that has learned, through long experience, that changing is uncomfortable and staying the same is at least familiar. These are not weaknesses. They are the standard equipment of being human. The question is not whether you have them. The question is whether you are going to let them make your decisions. Here is what the 16 chapters actually said, underneath the specific content of each one. Your beliefs were installed before you could evaluate them, and they can be updated through behavioral evidence. Confidence is residue, not fuel. Reframing requires going through the difficulty, not around it. Discipline is architecture, not willpower. Resilience is elasticity, not hardness. Emotions are information, not interference. Attention is finite, and everyone else already knows this. Failure is only useful if you process it rather than survive it. Stress is a signal, not a sentence. Learning stops when comfort starts. Purpose is constructed through action, not discovered through reflection. Letting go is a decision made repeatedly, not a feeling arrived at once. Relationships are infrastructure, not reward. Comparison is navigation using someone else's map. Identity is built by behavior, vote by vote. Growth lives at the edge of current capability, not in the comfortable interior of existing skill. 16 observations, all of them, in some form, available to anyone paying attention. None of them, in practice, easy to live by consistently. The difficulty is not a sign that you are doing it wrong. It is a sign that you are doing it, that you are engaged with the actual material of a life, rather than the curated version of one. I want to say something plainly that the genre typically delivers only in implication. The person you are capable of becoming is not dramatically different from the person you are now. This is not a limitation, it is a relief. The project of self-improvement, when it is organized around the fantasy of transformation, of becoming someone fundamentally other than who you currently are, produces a particular kind of suffering, because the self keeps failing to disappear on schedule. The actual project is quieter and more specific. It is the slow, cumulative work of becoming more fully and more deliberately yourself. More honest about your actual patterns, more skilled at the things that matter to you, more connected to the people who matter to you, more capable of tolerating the discomfort that growth requires without interpreting that discomfort as evidence that something has gone wrong. Nothing has gone wrong. Discomfort is the texture of the process. It has always been the texture of the process. Every person you have ever admired for their capability, their resilience, their apparent ease with difficulty, they were not comfortable. They were practiced. There is a difference, and it is the whole difference. What happens now is not complicated. You will return to your life. The life will present its usual assortment of difficulties, demands, and moments of genuine choice. Some of those moments you will handle better than you would have before. Some you will handle exactly as you would have before, and recognize it only afterward, and feel the particular frustration of knowing better and doing differently anyway. Both of these are part of the process. The recognition afterward is not failure. It is the examined mind doing its work, slower than you would like, more recursive than the books suggest, and genuinely, incrementally effective over time. The gap closes slowly. It closes through the accumulation of small, largely private, largely unglamorous decisions to act on what you know rather than to defer to what is comfortable. It closes through the maintenance of a few relationships so honest that they can hold you accountable without losing you. It closes through the willingness to locate the edge of your current capability and work there, repeatedly, in the full knowledge that you will be bad at it before you are good at it. It does not close completely. That is not the goal. The goal is direction, movement. The kind of slow, specific, real progress that does not photograph well and cannot be announced and accumulates over years into a life that is recognizably more examined than the one you started with. That is enough. It is, in fact, everything. The mind that examines itself is not a perfect mind. It is a live one, awake to its own patterns, honest about its own gaps, capable of the kind of growth that only becomes visible in retrospect and only becomes possible through the quiet, repeated decision to begin again.